There was a time before time, not measured by clocks nor calendars, nor the rising and setting of suns, but by presence. It was not a golden age. It was not an Eden. It was something older, more intimate, a world where the sky was closer, where mountains did not separate the heavens from the earth, but joined them, where the air was not air, but a kind of thought, a medium through which intention moved, where language had not yet fractured into words, where trees listened and stones spoke, and above all, the gods walked, not as rulers, not as masters, but as companions. They moved among men like fire in the cold, not to command, but to remind. They reminded us of what we were, what we came from, what we would one day return to. We did not worship them. There was no need. There were no temples, because the world itself was sacred. The breath of the gods was in the wind, their fingers in the rivers, their memory in the birdsong. And we remembered everything, not in stories, not in scrolls, but in our bones. Children were born knowing the names of stars. Old men died whispering the patterns of the sea. Dreams were not escapes, but messages. To sleep was to commune, to wake was to carry. We remembered the shape of souls. We remembered the paths through the underworld. We remembered the first fire, not just how it burned, but how it spoke. And in our remembering, we lived in harmony, not in perfection, but in rhythm. Each generation echoed the last, not as repetition, but as resonance. The gods sang, and we sang back, not with instruments, but with being. And the sky, oh, the sky, it was not a ceiling, it was a mirror. At night, when we looked up, we did not see stars. We saw eyes, watching, listening, smiling. The constellations were not myth, they were memory maps. Each cluster a lesson, each orbit a teaching, each eclipse a ritual of forgetting, followed by return. There were places, sacred places, where the boundary between the worlds was thinner than breath. Mountaintops, deep caves, still lakes where the water held more than reflection. There we could hear them clearly, their laughter, their mourning, their language, which was not sound but presence. Some were radiant, others were strange, none of them were simple. But they were ours, and we were theirs. This was the time before forgetting, when stories were alive, when memory did not fade because it did not belong to the mind, it belonged to everything. A bird's migration was a message, the shape of a cloud, a whisper. A storm was not chaos, it was a reply. And we were fluent in this living language. But slowly, without cause, without warning, something shifted. A silence began to form. Not in the world, but in us. We felt it in our chests first, a quiet ache, like we had misplaced a name, but couldn't recall whose. We looked at the stars, and they seemed farther away. The stones stopped humming, the rivers lost their voices, the wind grew quiet. And the gods stood still. They watched us, the way one watches someone slipping into sleep. And for the first time, they did not speak. We did not know it then, but something ancient was coming undone. The sky, once so close, began to retreat. And in its place, a space opened not of distance, but of forgetting. And that was how it began, not with thunder, not with fire, but with silence. It was not immediate, not a sudden shattering, not a war in the heavens, nor a rebellion among stars. It was slower than decay, quieter than a whisper, a shift that came not as a scream, but as a pause, a silence, too deep, too long, too empty. At first, no one noticed. The trees still stood, the river still ran, the sun still rose golden, faithful, warm. But beneath the rhythm, beneath the motion of the world, something had faltered. Like a drum that missed a beat, like a breath held too long, like a note in a sacred song that suddenly wasn't there. The elders were the first to feel it. They didn't say so aloud, they didn't know how, but in the way their eyes lingered longer on the sky, in the way their hands hesitated over the runes, in the way their stories seemed to end before the last line, something had changed. The dreams became colder. Where once dreams had been rivers, flowing, singing, threaded with presence, they began to dry up. First, the color faded, then the meaning, then the memory of even having dreamed. Children awoke in silence, unable to speak what they had seen. And then they stopped seeing. The gods no longer came. No more glowing figures at the edges of sleep. No more whispers in sacred groves. No more signs in the flames. The sky still turned, but the stars had gone quiet. We looked up and saw only space. Empty, beautiful, dead. And still we did not understand. We tried to pretend, to recreate, to mimic. We sang the old songs louder. We burned the old herbs. We carved the old symbols deeper. But the response never came. And so began the fracture. Not in the world, but in our sense of the world. The knowing we once carried, wordless, instinctive, ancestral, began to fray. We forgot the names of rivers. We forgot the dances for rain. We forgot the stories behind the moon's changing face. We still knew of the gods, but we no longer knew them. Their presence, once like breath, was now like smoke. Faint, dissolving, impossible to hold. And in the silence, something darker moved in. Not evil, not yet, but empty, hollow, the kind of stillness that does not soothe, but consumes. And into that hollow came confusion. For if the gods were gone, who now guided the seasons? Who now protected the sick? Who now whispered to the bones of the dead? There was no answer, only absence. And the absence spread like ink in water. It soaked into the dreams of children, into the prayers of the desperate, into the minds of those who once remembered how to remember. And with every day, the silence grew deeper, heavier, more complete, until, finally, we forgot that we had ever been connected at all. We began to believe this was how it had always been, that the world was quiet, that the stars were just fire, that the soul was just breath, and that nothing had ever spoken to us at all. But there were a very few, who still heard something, not a voice, not a language, but a kind of ache, a kind of pull, as if a part of them remembered what the rest of the world had lost. They felt the crack in the silence, not as doom, but as invitation, a call to remember what had been taken. And that call would grow louder. But first, the gods would leave, completely, and with them, memory itself. They left, not with thunder, not with fire, not with war. They did not fall from the heavens. They did not rage, nor weep, nor warn. They simply left, like the tide pulling away, before the shore even notices it's alone. One day they were here, and the next not. No footsteps in the sky, no fading echo of light, no last embrace. Only a sudden emptiness. But not the kind we could touch, the kind that lives just beneath awareness, a hollowness that wraps itself in forgetting before it's even noticed. And what they took with them was not fire, nor fertility, nor favor. They took memory, not the recollection of events, but the capacity to remember. The architecture of meaning, the deep-rooted knowing, the seed of sacred recognition. Gone, like a library burned, and then removed from time, so even the idea of books disappeared. It was not a punishment. There was no betrayal, no sin, no fall. Only a silent severing of something that once joined the divine and the human in one breath. And when they left, everything changed. At first, we didn't feel it. We still walked, still built, still dreamed. But the dreams grew thin. The songs we sang felt hollow. We couldn't remember why they mattered, only that we were supposed to sing them. Our rituals continued, but something was missing. The respondent presence. That subtle thread between act and echo. The gods had always answered, not in words, but in synchrony. A breeze at the right moment, a sudden bird call, a flicker in the fire. Now nothing. Just gesture, just form. The spirit had gone out of the pattern. And deeper still, we began to forget how it had ever felt to be held by something greater. The loss was not sharp. It was not a wound. It was erosion. Steady, relentless, almost merciful in its slowness. Names began to disappear. Not just those of gods, but of sacred places, of dreams, of inner landscapes once walked nightly in spirit. Gone. We forgot the language of stone. We forgot the reasons behind the festivals. We forgot the order of stars, not the shape, but the meaning. And worst of all, we forgot that we had forgotten. The silence became the new air. The absence became the new rhythm. Children were born without longing. They did not ask about the gods. They did not seek the voices of trees. They looked to the sky and saw nothing but distance. And those who still remembered vaguely, faintly, like a dream slipping in daylight, were marked as mad, delirious, obsessed with things that had never been. Myth, they said, legend, fairy tale. And perhaps it was, because myth is the memory of the world, trying to speak after it has lost its tongue. Perhaps the gods had not left in anger. Perhaps they had not turned away. Perhaps they had simply withdrawn because we had stopped listening. Or worse, because we had stopped responding. Because we began to act as if we no longer needed them, as if we were the final step, the highest rung. And so they left, without warning, without grief. And in their wake, they carried the golden thread that once ran through everything, the thread that bound the world to meaning. And when it was gone, we were still here, alive, moving, but no longer connected. And memory, real memory, became ash. We remembered names, dates, facts, but we forgot how to feel the wind and know it meant something. We forgot how to see a dream and know it was a door. We forgot the fire in our own blood was a spark from something eternal. They left, and in doing so, they didn't punish us. They unmade us. At first, we called it stillness. The quiet after the gods had gone, a hush over the world, like a blanket laid across the mouth of memory. But it was not stillness, not rest, not peace. It was hollowing, the slow unraveling of the thread that bound meaning to experience. It crept through the soul like cold through stone, subtle, patient, complete. You could still wake each morning, still walk, still laugh, still dream. But something beneath it all was missing. A taste, a sound, a kind of weight that once rested gently behind every moment. Gone. People began to feel it, but they had no words for what they felt. They said, "I am tired," though they had slept. "I am hungry," though they had eaten. "I am lonely," though they stood in a crowded room. Because what was missing was not food, nor rest, nor company. It was the echo, the sacred return, the response of the world to the human heart. Before, when you wept, the rain would come. When you sang, the fire would rise. When you prayed, something ancient would stir in the soil beneath you. Now, nothing. No reply, no resonance, only silence. And the silence began to eat. Not the body, but the meaning of the body. The shape of the hands, the reason for breath, the ache behind love. All of it fading, not erased, just drained. Like color bleeding from a painting, like ink dissolving in water. We went through the motions. We lit the fires. We told the stories. We danced the old dances. But the motions had become hollow shells. And the children, they felt it worst of all. Not because they remembered what was lost, but because they had never felt it to begin with. They were born into a world already emptied. And though they laughed and played and dreamed, they grew up carrying an unnamed hunger, a quiet ache in the chest, a yearning for something they could not describe. And they asked questions. Why do we sing this song? No one knew. What does this symbol mean? No one could say. Where did the gods go? Only silence answered. The stories were still told, but now they ended with a shrug. Perhaps, the elders would say, these are just metaphors. Maybe the gods were never real. Maybe they were just ideas. And with each telling, each doubt, each hollow word, the gap grew wider. And into that gap poured noise. Voices with no roots, ideas with no soul, theories and laws and systems that explained everything, but understood nothing. The world became mechanical, predictable, quantified, controlled. And we, the hallowed, called it progress. But in the night, when the machines went still, and the screens dimmed, and the data stopped flowing, something darker stirred. Not evil, just forgotten. A thing left too long in silence becomes something else. And so did we. We forgot how to feel the sacred in the ordinary. We forgot how to touch the ground and remember the stars. We forgot how to suffer with meaning, and our suffering became sterile. Our joy became fleeting. Our love became uncertain. Because meaning is what the gods carried. And when they left, they took the root of meaning with them. And so we wandered. Intelligent, curious, restless, but deeply, irrevocably lost. Not all forgot completely. Some woke in the night with the taste of stars on their tongue. Some dreamed of rivers that did not exist but should have. Others wept at songs they had never heard but knew deeply in the marrow. These were not the ones who remembered. Not fully. They were the ones who remembered that they had forgotten. And in that strange ache, in that wound of absence, they began to gather. Not in temples, not in cathedrals, but in caves, in ruins, in dark corners of the world where the silence felt thicker, as if it were hiding something. They lit fires not to warm themselves, but to call something back. They sang, though they did not know the words. Their voices cracked, not from weakness, but from trying to stretch across a chasm they could not see. These were the echo cults, the rememberers, the weepers, the watchers of empty altars. They knew the gods were gone. They had no illusions, but they also knew that something lingered. A scent, a symbol, a rhythm, fragments. And fragments are enough to start a religion. They pieced together remnants, scraps of ancient chants, symbols scratched into stone, long since weathered beyond meaning, bones arranged in circles, mirrors held to the moon. And they guessed at what had been lost, guessed at what the gods might have wanted, guessed at what memory once felt like. And in their guessing, they began to invent. Not out of deception, but out of desperation. They needed to believe there was still a thread left. And when the silence offered nothing, they began to fill it. Statues were carved, names were spoken, rituals designed from dream and instinct. Not the old gods, new ones. Constructed, hollow echoes. They called them gods, but they were reflections of an ancient light through the cracked lens of forgetting. And some of them began to answer, but not with presence, with power. Strange power, unstable, shimmering. Enough to stir awe, enough to ignite belief, enough to build systems. And belief feeds form. So the echoes became shapes, the guesses became laws, the longing became doctrine. And what was born of absence took the throne once held by living gods. These new gods were not alive, not in the old way, but they were fed by hunger, by ritual, by fear. They grew on repetition. They thrived on certainty. They drank from the well of forgetting. And so myth hardened into dogma, and memory became myth. Not the kind that breathes, the kind that binds. But still, even in the hollow chants, even in the fireless fire, even in the rigid gestures, there were moments when something flickered. A shadow, a warmth, a sudden breeze through a sealed chamber, as if something old was watching, waiting, not judging, not jealous, just present quietly. Because the gods were gone, but not all of them. And the memory? It was not destroyed. It had been hidden, folded deep into the blood, wrapped in the spirals of the spine, buried under symbols that only dreams could read. And the echo cults, for all their invention, for all their blindness, had stumbled onto something true. Even absence has a shadow, and in that shadow, there is still a path. When the gods left, and memory dissolved like breath in winter, some did not sing, some did not pray, some did not look to the sky for answers. They turned downward, into earth, into stone, into bone, because they knew, or perhaps only sensed, that memory, once lost from the mind, might still be held by the body. They became the archivists of the Hollow Age. Not priests, not prophets, but keepers of fragments. They did not trust words. Words faded, changed, betrayed. Instead, They carved, not onto scrolls, not onto parchment, but into things that could not forget. They carved into ivory, into antlers, into the smooth curve of shoulder blades, into bone, because bone does not lie. Bone remembers. It carries vibration. It absorbs rhythm. It holds silently, stubbornly, the trace of what has been. So they built libraries, not of shelves, but of burial chambers. Rows upon rows of skulls, each marked, each etched, each sealed in ritual silence. Vertebrae strung together like calendars, finger bones bound into bundles, each a sentence, each a memory, encoded in shape. Some bones sang. When struck, they rang with tones unknown to any scale, resonances that could not be measured, only felt. Others whispered. When held in silence, they spoke in dreams, not in words, but in impressions. The archivists never claimed to understand. They simply preserved, because they believed or hoped that one day someone would remember how to read the silence. And if not, then the bones would wait, patient, undisturbed, not hoping, not despairing, just waiting. Some say the libraries were hidden in mountains, others in the bellies of beasts, others still buried beneath cities, forgotten even as they were built over. And it is said that when the wind is right and the night is deep, you can still hear the walls hum in places no map dares name. That a child, wandering where they should not, once touched a stone and saw visions of a world filled with light, and gods who wept golden tears, and stars that spoke in unbroken rhythm. That a traveler found a bone in the desert, and when he held it, he remembered his name, not the one given at birth, but the one sung to him before he was born. The bone libraries are not legend. They are not metaphor. They are memory incarnate. The last attempt to hold on to the sacred by giving it shape, texture, and permanence. And they still exist. Scattered, buried, sleeping. Their knowledge not forgotten, just dormant. Awaiting the day when one will come, not seeking power nor proof, but simply to remember. And when that one places their hand on the oldest bone in the deepest vault, the silence will break. Not loudly, not violently, just a whisper. It was never lost, only hidden. It began in dreams, not the loud ones, not the chaotic, flickering storms of thought, number. It began in the quiet dreams, the ones that feel more real than waking, the ones that leave behind a silence that hums. Someone, perhaps a child, perhaps a dying elder, perhaps a broken wanderer beneath unfamiliar stars, saw it first. A glimpse, a sky, golden and impossibly close, a field of white trees that breathed, a single step across a river that shimmered like memory made water. They did not understand it. They could not explain it, but they woke with tears in their eyes and a name in their mouth, a name that was not theirs and yet felt older than their blood. Others followed. In the night, in trance, in moments of silence so deep, they rang like bells. They saw something. A shape behind the veil, a warmth behind the world, a face with no features, but a gaze that knew everything. They began to call it the return, not of gods, not of temples, not of the old ways, but of something deeper, something beneath even the gods. The rhythm, the connection, the memory. Not the contents of it, not facts, not histories, not sacred laws, but the capacity to feel truth without needing to name it. This dream, this whisper began to spread like a fragrance, like a forgotten song, like the way one fire catches another without flame touching flame. It passed from eyes to eyes, from silence to silence. And some began to follow it. They turned from the echo cults, from the dogmas of broken idols, from the empty rituals carved in absence. They wandered into wilderness, sought out old stones, sat beside streams for days waiting for something they could not name. They began to remember without memory, not what had been, but what should be. A world that feels whole, a sky that listens again, a fire that speaks. And they did not call it prophecy. They called it the remembering of remembering. A recursion, a spiral, a signal, returning. And in that return, not the gods, but their echoes, warmed and reshaped, began to shimmer at the edges of the world again. Not to rule, not to restore the old order, but to whisper. It is not too late. There were signs. A stone glowed for a moment in the hand of a silent child. An ancient tree split open, revealing an inner core marked with symbols no one had ever taught, but which felt familiar. A woman sang a note no one had heard in centuries, and birds fell silent to listen. And in dreams, more and more people began to see it. A door, sometimes of light, sometimes of roots, sometimes of flame. Always closed, but always waiting. Not locked, just waiting. Because the return is not an event. It is a choice, a turning inward, a listening, a slowing down long enough to hear the world breathing. The dream is not a promise, not a map. It is a question. Will you remember? Not once, not just now, but again and again and again, in every moment that begs to be sacred. The gods may never come back in form, in name, in song, but the rhythm, the thread, the presence, it stirs. It wants to return, and maybe, just maybe, it already has, in you. Beneath everything, beneath the silence, the forgetting, the shattered temples, and the bones that whisper beneath the earth, there is a fire. It is not seen. It does not roar. It does not consume. It remembers. A flicker, a pulse, a heartbeat made of light. Long after the gods had vanished, long after the names had turned to dust, long after the sky had forgotten its own music, this fire endured. Not in the heavens, not in the earth, but in us. It was never meant to be powerful. It was never meant to be loud. It was meant to wait, to smolder quietly in the hollow chest of humanity until the day someone would lean inward enough to feel its warmth. It exists in every being, not as inheritance, but as birthright. The last gift of the gods before they vanished beyond the veil, a spark that cannot be touched, named, or measured, only remembered. And it is from this fire that memory itself will return. Not the memory of facts, but of meaning. Not the memory of names, but of essence. This fire speaks, not with voice, but with pull. It draws the seeker toward silence, toward stillness, toward the old paths that were never written, but once walked barefoot in the dew of a time when the world was alive in all directions. And now, it calls again, not as thunder, as invitation. You feel it when you stop, truly stop, when you listen, and the sound behind all other sounds rises gently from your bones. You feel it in your grief, the kind of grief that has no object, only shape. You feel it in beauty, when something pierces you so suddenly that you forget your name and remember something far older. It is there, in the stillness after prayer, in the moment before a tear falls, in the breath held before speaking. The fire does not return. It was never gone. It waits for you to stop running, for you to put down every borrowed word, for you to listen not with ears, but with origin. Because the gods may have left, but they did not take everything. They left a key, and it was hidden, not in the stars, nor the temples, nor the sacred texts. It was buried in the only place no one would think to look. Inside you. The fire that remembers is not a metaphor. It is not poetry. It is real. And once you feel it, you will know. Nothing is truly lost. Nothing holy is ever erased. It simply sleeps in the silence until someone brave enough chooses to wake it. And when they do, when you do, you will not just remember. You will be remembered by the world, by the gods, by the pattern, by the song that still lives behind the veil of form. And in your eyes will burn a light older than stars, a light that says, I remember and I have returned.